I've always believed that trees remember things. They hold the wind, the ash, the scent of rain in their bark. They witness things we forget. When I first bought the lot at the edge of Pine Hollow, a long, sloping patch of land that the realtor called useless backside buffer, I didn't see it as useless at all. I saw it as the one place I could finally breathe. I had spent 28 years in the U.S. Forest Service, 28 seasons watching the cycles of fire, flood, regrowth, and loss. I knew what it meant to lose everything to a wall of flame. I had stood knee-deep in soot where homes once stood handing stuffed bears to trembling children while smoke still lingered. I had walked charred paths with widows who couldn't speak. So when I retired, I didn't dream of ocean views or pristine golf courses. I wanted quiet. Trees, space to remember. That's why. The first thing I did after moving into my modest two-story home on Ann Ridgeway Trail was plant that windbreak. It wasn't fancy, just a deliberate, zigzagged row of hardy species Austrian pines, bur oaks, native junipers. Trees that could bend with the wind and hold the slope when rains came. I paid for every seedling myself, logged every planting angle by compass, and worked with a state reforestation advisor who had been a rookie ranger back when I was her mentor. It wasn't just landscaping, it was living infrastructure, and I documented all of it. Back then, the HOA was quiet. The old board president, Mr. Tanaka, a retired postal worker with arthritis and an easy smile, had looked at my plans, shrugged, and said, "If you can keep the deer out, go for it." And so I did. Years passed. The pines stretched skyward. They formed a solid curtain catching the northern winds before they blasted across the neighborhood's open field. In winter, the tree line reduced wind chill on my home by 10 degrees. In summer, it shaded the back fence and created a nesting corridor for birds. Neighbors sometimes joked about how natural my place looked, like it belonged on a ranger calendar. I never said much, just nodded. I kept to myself mostly. I wasn't unfriendly. I just didn't care for the wine tastings or monthly garage cleanups that Karen and her circle took so seriously. I paid my dues. I followed the noise ordinances. I maintained my home and my trees. That was the unspoken pact. I gave them no trouble, and they gave me none. Until 2 months ago. It started with a folded paper taped to my mailbox. No envelope, just bold font. Notice of vegetation review, Lot 116. The language was generic at first, about maintaining visual consistency and eliminating overgrowth. But the last paragraph caught my eye. The board has identified excessive natural screening and non-standard perimeter foliage that may pose aesthetic or safety risks to adjacent properties. I remember standing there with the notice in one hand and my coffee in the other, rereading the word excessive like it was a personal insult. I didn't panic. I had seen this kind of bureaucratic drift before, people with too much time and not enough understanding looking for problems where none existed. I drafted a calm, respectful letter outlining the planting's origins, the soil retention benefits, the shade analysis, the conservation support. I attached diagrams, photos, even the original soil survey from 2001. No one responded. 2 weeks passed. I figured it had been dropped. I even saw one of the board members, Rick, walking his dog past my driveway, and he gave me a cheerful wave. I was wrong, because while I was visiting my son near Flagstaff for the long weekend, they came. My neighbor, Maria, an elderly woman who lives 2 lots down and always bakes too many muffins, called me in tears. She'd heard chainsaws, loud ones. She stepped out and saw hired contractors ripping through the tree line. They had marked trunks with orange spray paint and were cutting them clean through. Logs were being hauled onto flatbeds, limbs tossed into chippers. She tried to stop them. She told them it was private property, but one of the workers showed her a paper, some kind of authorization, and kept going. By the time I got home, all that remained of my tree line were stumps, dozens of them flat-topped and pale like open wounds. It was like stepping into a bad dream. The slope looked naked, harsh, unanchored. Wind cut across it freely now, and dust swirled in every corner. Where the pines once sang, there was only silence and the smell of sap. They didn't just cut trees, they erased a part of me. Years of careful planning. Hours of pruning, of nurturing, of letting roots anchor a scarred land. Gone. I stood in that broken space, fists clenched, breath shallow, trying not to shake. My dog, Tiller. A lumbering Labrador with one ear that never stands straight sat beside me and whined softly. I don't remember walking back to the house. I don't remember putting the keys down or taking off my boots. I just remember the cold realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding. They had meant to do this, and the worst part, I had no idea why. Not yet. The first time I ever met Karen McClintock in person was 3 days after I got home to find my trees butchered. I'd seen her around, of course, brisk walks in pastel jogging suits, always with a clipboard or phone in hand, always too busy to say hello. The kind of person who made HOA leadership her entire personality. But until that afternoon, we had never shared more than a glance. I arrived at the clubhouse 5 minutes before the board meeting was set to begin, carrying a binder under one arm and a printed aerial map under the other. The lobby was filled with the low murmur of retirees, yoga moms, and golf-shirted husbands who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. A hand-lettered poster read, "Monthly HOA Meeting. Community Pride Through Action." I took a seat near the back and waited. The meeting started with the usual ceremony roll call, the pledge approving minutes from last month. Karen sat at the head of the folding table, flanked by Rick, who looked vaguely uncomfortable, and a woman I didn't recognize, scribbling notes in a planner. Karen's voice was smooth, bright, and cold. She reminded me of someone who'd practiced being friendly, but had no real interest in it. And now, she said, clasping her hands like a kindergarten teacher, "I'd like to share some exciting progress in our perimeter beautification initiative." She clicked a remote, and a screen behind her lit up with photos before and after shots. I froze. One of the images showed my trees. Proud and strong, captioned "Before." Unsafe visual barrier. The next photo showed bare earth and chopped stumps after, clean and code compliant. The room murmured in approval. I could feel my jaw lock. Karen smiled. "We've removed over 70 linear feet of unpermitted overgrown vegetation that blocked sight lines and created a hazard near common space. We're working hard to keep Pine Hollow safe and beautiful for everyone." I raised my hand. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, Mr. Dalton, is it?" "That was my property," I said. Calm but not soft. "The trees you removed weren't in common space. They were mine, on a federally mitigated slope planted after the Sol 98 Ridge Fire." A few heads turned. Karen's smile stayed frozen. "I understand the confusion," she said lightly. "But the area in question falls within the HOA's 30-foot perimeter zone, which we're authorized to maintain under Article 6, Section 3. I opened my binder and held up the aerial map. "With respect, that's incorrect. I had this area surveyed when I purchased the property. These trees are entirely within my deeded lot. I have topographic overlays and GPS confirmation. Would you like a copy?" Her smile wavered. "Mr. Dalton, I don't think this is the appropriate forum to dispute property boundaries. You're welcome to submit a grievance to our landscaping committee if you feel—" I cut in. Twice, no one responded. Now the room was fully quiet. Karen leaned forward, her voice still controlled but tighter. "The board acted in good faith to protect community aesthetics and safety. The trees were not approved and their condition was deteriorating. Frankly, we're surprised you didn't volunteer to remove them yourself." The audacity almost made me laugh. "They were Austrian pines and bur oaks," I said flatly. "Perfectly healthy, planted with state funding and certified as a windbreak barrier. You destroyed a federally documented ecological buffer without permission. And you don't even realize what you've exposed the neighborhood to." Karen tilted her head. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Dalton?" I let out a breath. "No, nature is." At that moment, Rick leaned in and whispered something to her. She waved him off, eyes still fixed on me. "You're welcome to speak with our legal liaison," she said. "This discussion is over." The meeting resumed. Talk shifted to sidewalk, chalk policies, and Halloween decorations, but my ears were ringing. I left before it ended the silence of the hall, trailing me like a shadow. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the binder spread open, flipping through old documentation, forestry letters, conservation zone maps. I had every paper, every date, every approval, yet they acted like I was some crank with backyard weeds. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the city zoning office. and submitted copies of the documents to the State Department of Environmental Conservation. I also contacted an old friend, Nancy Yates, who now worked at the state's Urban Forestry Division. She remembered my tree line. She had helped me write the original planting proposal. "This is more than just a landscaping issue, Wes," she told me. "Those trees were part of a mitigation project. If they were removed without proper review, there could be liability, especially if wind damage occurs." I nodded slowly. That's what I'm afraid of, because I had seen the forecasts. I'd been tracking the models even before the trees were cut. And now that barrier was gone, there was nothing shielding the clubhouse from the valley winds that came screaming down the ridgeline every fall. Nothing but open sky. And when I drove past the clubhouse the next afternoon, I saw something that twisted in my gut. New patio furniture, wide umbrellas, hanging flower baskets, exposed glass panels. They had no idea what was coming. And Karen, she thought she'd won. She had no idea what she'd unleashed. It still felt surreal, like waking up to find your memories vandalized. The stumps outside my fence were bright raw and jagged, still leaking sap that had begun to crystallize in amber beads. Insects were already exploring the torn cambium layers. The soil beneath them, once shaded and cool, was sunbaked and crusting. The hillside looked like a surgical wound left open mid-operation. And no one, not one person, had so much as knocked on my door to ask permission. I kept replaying Maria's voicemail in my head, the one she'd left the day it happened. Her voice had cracked halfway through. "Wesley, I tried to tell them. I told them it was your land. They said they had orders." A woman in a white SUV dropped off paperwork and left. They didn't even slow down. I'd been in Flagstaff visiting my son, Ethan, and his new baby girl. I hadn't wanted to leave. I hadn't seen him smile like that in years, but I drove the 9 hours back overnight when Maria called. I remember white-knuckling the wheel at 3 a.m., whispering to myself over and over. They wouldn't. They couldn't. Not those trees. But they had, and they did. The crew hadn't just removed the trunks. They'd uprooted sections, scraped surface soil down to bare mineral shredded juniper saplings into mulch piles and rutted tire tracks deep into the incline. Some of the larger stumps were splintered midway, cut too quickly or clumsily. Whoever they'd hired wasn't experienced with slope-sensitive terrain. To them, it was just brush clearing. They had no idea that the layer of trees had helped stop slope erosion every time we had a thunderstorm. My first instinct had been disbelief, then grief, and then a sharp, volcanic fury I hadn't felt since my days chasing arsonists through charred canyons in Muscle, Nevada. I filed my police report that same day, not because I expected the sheriff to act, but because I knew the paper trail mattered. The deputy, a young guy named Rios, was polite but cautious. He took photos, copied the parcel number, and jotted a few notes while glancing around the ruined slope like he couldn't quite tell what the big deal was. "You're saying this was all on your lot?" he asked. I pulled out the survey map. From that utility pole down to that granite marker, see the red border? He squinted. "HOA says they thought it was common area." I nodded slowly. "And I thought about selling this place and moving to a lake house. But I didn't act on it either." He gave a short laugh. "Well, we'll make a record of it. Best follow up with civil channels, too." I already had. I'd spent the morning sending certified letters to the HOA board, the landscaping contractor, and their insurance firm. I attached all documentation, my property deed, the original tree planting agreement with the state's Forest Resilience Program, dated photographs of the tree line over the past 15 years, and maps showing slope grade before and after the trees had matured. I sent the same package to my lawyer, a quiet, deliberate man named August Renner, who looked like he'd been born wearing a wool vest. He wasn't flashy, but he had a memory like a steel trap and a quiet way of tearing people apart in deposition without ever raising his voice. "I'll file the tort claim notice Monday," August told me. "Then we'll see if they want to play hardball or settle before this gets messy. My guess, Karen thinks she's untouchable. Those types usually push until something breaks." "Good," I said. "Let her push." The next day, I walked the property line with a digital level and topographic surveyor I'd hired out of my own pocket. His name was Eli, a third-generation land tech who nodded with approval at the pine stumps and said, "They were holding this whole incline, weren't they? Looks like it'll wash out now if we get a hard rain. Or wind," I added. "Come November, we'll get both." He didn't say anything for a while, just pointed to a shallow gully forming already, where one stump had been removed and the slope left unshored. "This is going to bite someone," he said finally. And then it happened. 4 days later, the weather alert came in. I was drinking coffee at dawn when my NOAA radio crackled alive. Wind advisory in effect through Sunday night. Gusts up to 55 mph expected along ridgeline corridors and exposed valleys. I stood up slowly and walked to the back window. The trees were gone, and in their place, nothing. The HOA Clubhouse sat just downwind on a slight rise, maybe 200 yards from where the windbreak had stood. Between us and them, nothing but brittle lawn and a few decorative hedges that wouldn't stop a breath of air, let alone valley gusts funneled between the cliffs beyond the canyon bend. I saw 2 workers out by the clubhouse that morning setting up what looked like temporary cabanas. Folding tables, party lights. Someone was preparing for the upcoming fall festival. I almost couldn't believe it. I stepped outside. The air had already started to move in strange bursts, pulses, that teased leaves into spirals before falling flat. That kind of strange stillness before pressure systems crash. I wanted to scream. I wanted to march down to the HOA office and shake sense into Karen. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I walked the slope again. I documented everything. Photos, wind trajectory notes, soil movement. I took a video clip of how the wind now accelerated downhill, using a smoke pencil to show the shift in current. Then I sent it all to Nancy Yates. Her reply came 3 hours later. This is not just negligence, Wes. It's environmental liability. If that clubhouse takes damage and the windbreak was removed without proper environmental review, the HOA could be on the hook for full restitution. I saved the email, printed it, and added it to my binder. Because now it wasn't just personal. It was structural. And nature wasn't going to wait for them to wake up. The wind arrived before the storm did. It started like a whisper, branches quivering, flags snapping half-heartedly on front porches. But by the time I left my house that Thursday afternoon to walk up to the HOA office, it had started its usual descent from the canyon, sharp, dry, and curling around the ridge like it had a mind of its own. I knew that kind of wind. It wasn't aimless. It was searching for resistance. And without the windbreak trees, it would find nothing but glass and siding. I didn't go to the clubhouse meeting that day out of revenge. I went because I needed her to look me in the eye. The HOA's main office was tucked behind the tennis courts housed in the same over-decorated building that served as both event center and management hub. Faux columns, brick veneer, a red metal roof that always shimmered too brightly in the sun. Inside it smelled like laminate flooring-scented plug-ins and overly air-conditioned paper. Karen was standing behind the reception counter when I walked in. She was reviewing a clipboard with 2 other board members, both men, both with the sunken, weary look of men who'd said yes to too many bake sales and banner fundraisers. She looked up. Her mouth tightened slightly, but she didn't miss a beat. "Mr. Dalton," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Do you have an appointment?" "I have the wind," I replied. One of the board members glanced toward the door as if expecting it to blow off its hinges. The other shifted awkwardly. Karen set down her clipboard. "If this is about the landscaping issue, we've already addressed it. Have you?" I took a slow step forward, placing my binder gently on the counter. "Because I just spoke with the State Urban Forestry Division, and they've confirmed on record that the tree line you destroyed was part of a registered wind mitigation zone under the Ridge Fire Recovery Grant. That means you didn't just clear overgrowth. You violated a federally documented ecological barrier." Karen raised an eyebrow. "We were told the area was unclaimed HOA-maintained slope." "By whom?" I asked. "Your gut instinct, because I have 3 surveys that say otherwise. Not to mention deed overlays, annotated GIS maps, and a floodplain file that lists that slope as protected terrain. I don't think this is the place." "No, Karen." I cut her off, voice still low but sharp. "This is exactly the place. Because you didn't ask. You didn't check. You didn't so much as post a notice on my door. You hired someone to come into my land, destroy 27 trees, and walk away like it was a shrub trimming service." Karen exhaled through her nose, folding her arms. "Look, Mr. Dalton, we acted with the understanding that those trees were a liability. They obstructed visibility. They were irregularly maintained, and the community has repeatedly requested that unsightly barriers be removed, especially those bordering community amenities. I laughed, incredulous. Unsightful, those trees were the only reason the eastern end of this development hasn't blown away in the last 5 winters. And now, with a windstorm days away, you're hosting a fall festival in a glass-walled clubhouse that has zero protection and is perched directly in the wind channel. You don't even understand what you've done. We've consulted with our own arborist, she said, lips thinning, and he reported no ecological risk. Your arborist? I opened my binder flipping pages until I found the screenshot. You mean Joe Lincoln from Green Star Tree Services, the one who did your Christmas lights last year. He's not a forester, Karen. He's a trimmer. He's not certified in slope mitigation, wind corridor evaluation, or federal land use compliance. But sure. Let's take his word over a retired Forest Service officer and 2 state agencies. One of the board members cleared his throat. Maybe we should revisit the documentation. Karen shot him a look that silenced him instantly. Then she turned to me, her tone dropping an octave. Let's be honest, Mr. Dalton. This isn't about trees. It's about control. You've always kept to yourself, planted things your way, ignored architectural guidelines, refused to participate in neighborhood events. That kind of independence might work when you live on a ranch. But here, we live in a community. That means compromises. I felt the fury rise, but I kept my breath steady. No, Karen. This is about respect for the land, for law, for boundaries, literal and otherwise. You've mistaken stewardship for defiance, and now you're about to learn what happens when nature fills the gap you created. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Behind her, a decorative poster for the fall festival fluttered in the draft from the main entrance. It showed pumpkins, hay bales, and string lights, and behind them the fully exposed eastern windows of the clubhouse. I gathered my things and turned to leave. Oh, I added, looking back over my shoulder. You might want to check with your insurance adjuster. Once they see the maps, they'll know this wasn't just an act of nature. It was an act of negligence. Outside, the wind was stronger. Trees bent along the sidewalk edges. Leaves lifted and spun in tight funnels before collapsing. It was only Thursday, and already the air felt wrong, charged. I walked back toward my house, slowly watching the sky. Pale clouds were starting to form over the ridgeline, thin, high, and moving faster than they should. The canyon's mouth was already howling in short bursts, like a kettle left on the stove too long. By nightfall, gusts were reaching 30 miles per hour, and the real storm hadn't even started yet. The wind didn't let up overnight. By Friday morning, it had become a constant presence, pressing against the windows, slipping beneath the eaves, rattling the bird feeders until they clinked like bells. It wasn't a storm yet, not officially. Just a dry front sweeping in from the canyon with an attitude. But I knew what it meant. It meant the ground was drying, the air was sharpening, and all the little vulnerabilities that the trees had once softened were now left exposed to bite. And people still weren't paying attention. Kids rode their bikes past the clubhouse. Someone had tied paper ghosts to the fence posts for the fall festival, and they flapped like desperate flags. Over at Lot 73, a Halloween skeleton sat grinning in a lawn chair, sunglasses, tilted, one bony hand raised in a plastic wave. Pine Hollow had no idea it was about to get a lesson in consequence. I, on the other hand, was busy digging not through dirt but through memory. My garage was a museum of records. Old field maps, reforestation binders, disaster mitigation plans from back in my days with the Forest Service. I kept everything, not because I was obsessive, but because I'd seen too many fires start from ignored paperwork. People forget the history of the land until the land reminds them. And it always does. In a black filing cabinet near the back wall, I found the original proposal, Ridgeway Fire Recovery Replanting Plan, 2001. My name was on it, signed in pen. It listed all 27 trees, their species spacing, slope grade calculations, and intended windbreak function. Attached was a signed letter from the state forestry engineer confirming the grant that had covered half the cost, along with a map noting the critical wind corridor buffer zone on my property. The slope in question was shaded pale green and labeled Private Lot 116's Windbreak Designated Area. I exhaled slowly. Proof. I added it all to my growing binder and backed it up to a flash drive, then emailed a copy to August Renner, my attorney. 15 minutes later, he called. Wes. This is ironclad, he said. If they try to dispute property lines, now we've got dated state maps, grant signatures, topographic overlays. Hell, this is better than I hoped. They're not gonna back down, I told him. Not yet. Karen's convinced she's protecting the community from rogue trees and unruly residents. August chuckled. Then let's show her what happens when rogue trees have federal documentation behind them. By that afternoon, I had also heard back from Nancy Yates, my old colleague at the Urban Forestry Division. Wes, I've escalated your complaint, she wrote. Not only did the HOA fail to file an environmental impact review, but removing a registered windbreak in a designated risk zone without state consultation may violate multiple urban conservation statutes. If damage occurs because of the removal liability, becomes compounded. That last word stuck with me, compounded. In Pine Hollow, things were rarely compounded. They were aesthetic, predictable, glossy. We didn't deal with fire zones or wind tunnels until now. And now they had just cut out the only buffer standing between a seasonal canyon current and a wall of floor-to-ceiling clubhouse glass. It was almost poetic, tragic but poetic. Late that night, I walked the slope again with a flashlight and notebook. I stood near the edge where the trees used to break the wind holding a ribbon on a metal stake. The gusts snapped it flat like a warning. I used my anemometer to measure velocity, 38 mph. My jaw tightened. From that vantage, I could see the clubhouse fully exposed in the moonlight. Its freshly painted pergola, the tidy row of Adirondack chairs, a new fire pit installation gleaming in stone, all of it completely vulnerable. They hadn't reinforced a single thing. Just as I was turning to go, I saw headlights approaching from the east service road. A white SUV. Karen's. She parked near the side gate and got out, jacket pressed tight against her body hair, flaring sideways in the wind. She walked to the clubhouse side entrance and unlocked the door, vanishing inside. Curious, I waited, stepping back behind the utility box that sat just off the path. A few minutes passed. Then the lights inside flicked on, and I saw her silhouette moving around inside the glass-walled main room. She wasn't alone. There were papers on the table, a laptop. She was speaking to someone on a video call. I couldn't hear her, of course, but from her gestures and the way she kept pointing toward the east-facing wall, I could guess. She was worried. She should have been. I watched her for a long time. Part of me wanted to walk in right then. Tell her what I knew, what was coming, what the law said. But I didn't, because Karen wasn't someone who listened to words, she only responded to consequences. And those were coming faster than she realized. Back at home, I made my final preparations. I printed duplicates of every page in my binder, tree surveys, grant records, soil tests, wind modeling diagrams, and even stills from a video I had taken showing how debris used to gather behind the trees, but now blew straight into the clubhouse lawn. I placed everything into labeled folders, one for the HOA legal team, one for the city council, and one for the local paper. I wasn't bluffing. If that windstorm hit hard, and if that damage landed squarely where I knew it would, I would ensure that every resident in Pine Hollow knew exactly why. They thought they were beautifying the neighborhood. All they did was rip out its lungs, and nature was already starting to scream. Saturday morning arrived under a sky that looked scraped raw. The sun rose behind a thick band of dusty haze, casting the neighborhood in a grainy, yellow light, the kind that sets your teeth on edge before you even know why. The wind had not subsided. In fact, it had intensified overnight. Pine Hollow's decorative Halloween displays were either on their sides or had vanished altogether. An inflatable witch had taken up residence in the clubhouse fountain, and someone's plastic gravestone had impaled itself into my front hedge like a javelin. The fall festival was still on. There were signs posted on lampposts. Pumpkin patch, chili cook-off, face painting, 2 p.m. at the clubhouse lawn. As if none of the conditions around us had changed. As if the air wasn't moving in gusts powerful enough to knock over folding tables. As if the brittle conditions and rising heat index didn't scream fire hazard and structural vulnerability. As if the windbreak trees had never existed. Karen McClintock was undeterred. I passed her that morning at the entrance to the clubhouse as she oversaw a group of volunteers setting up tents and sound equipment. Her clipboard was clutched tight against her chest like a holy relic. She saw me. I saw her. Neither of us said a word, but the wind spoke for us both. By midday, gusts were reaching sustained speeds in the 40s. Leaves blew in horizontal streams across the sidewalks. Dust gathered in eddies near curb corners, and even the sturdier kids' bikes were being walked instead of ridden. I spotted one of the HOA's junior board members, Tyler Finch, struggling to secure a banner above the entrance. His foot slipped on a corner of the plastic tarp and the ladder wobbled under him like a drunk on stilts. He caught himself just before it toppled. At 1:15 p.m., I received a call from Nancy Yates. Wes, she said, we just got internal clearance to issue a preliminary warning. I'm not saying full liability is guaranteed if damage occurs, but your documentation has created a clear enough chain. If that clubhouse gets hit, it will. I cut in calmly. There was a pause. Then so will they, she said. But I need you to stay safe. You don't need to be the one proving anything when it all goes sideways. I'm not proving it, I said. I'm just letting it speak. The festival began at 2:07 p.m., according to the music. The sound system sputtered through bursts of static as speakers were jostled by the shifting wind. A small crowd had gathered, mostly families, a few retirees, teenagers in hoodies pretending they weren't cold. I stayed on my porch far enough away to observe close enough to witness. The sky darkened not with clouds but with dust. The dry air pulled topsoil from garden beds and layered a fine grit across everything. I watched a cluster of helium balloons snap from a booth and shoot skyward like startled geese. One struck a streetlight and exploded with a pop that made half the crowd jump. And then just before 3:00 p.m., it happened. A roar, not thunder, but wind in force, rushed down from the canyon mouth. You could see it hit like a wave against a hillside. Trees leaned violently. Lawn chairs flipped. Paper signs were shredded in seconds. And the east-facing wall of the clubhouse, the one built from unreinforced glass panels, now bare, without the protection of my pines, took a direct blast. 3 panels cracked at once. There was a sound like a shotgun, then another and another. Glass didn't just shatter, it collapsed inward, raining over the festival tables and sending shrieks across the lawn. Parents grabbed children. Vendors ran for their tents. One table flipped entirely, slamming into the side of the popcorn machine and knocking over a decorative cauldron that began belching smoke as it sparked. Someone screamed that it was on fire. It wasn't, not yet, but I could smell the wiring frying. Karen burst from the clubhouse, her hair tangled, her clipboard gone. She was yelling something no one could hear. Tyler Finch was on his knees by the speaker system trying to unplug something, and Rick, mild-mannered Rick, was on his phone, backing away from the glass with eyes wide and mouth open like a man watching a tornado swallow his barn. From my porch I watched. It wasn't glee I felt, it wasn't triumph, it was grief. Because this never had to happen. If they had just listened, if they had asked, if they had understood what the land does when it's stripped of protection. Within minutes, emergency sirens sounded. A fire truck arrived from Station 9, followed by a patrol SUV from the HOA Sheriff's Office. EMTs started checking a few minor injuries, mostly cuts from flying debris, and mild shock. I saw one woman on a stretcher wrapped in a blanket, while her daughter held a bag of candy like it had betrayed her. Karen was now in full panic. She paced near the clubhouse steps, shouting into her phone, gesturing wildly at the damage. When the sheriff approached her, she thrust papers toward him. Probably some poor copy of bylaws or landscaping notes, but he shook his head and pointed toward the shattered windows. I could hear only fragments of their exchange carried by the gusts. Wasn't supposed to happen. Windbreak trees, what trees? And then the sheriff turned. He looked straight at my house. Our eyes met. He gave a short nod. Half an hour later, I got the call. It was August. Well, he said, I've got 2 voicemails from their counsel and one from the HOA insurer already. Guess they're feeling the breeze now. I didn't say anything. They're asking if you'd be open to mediation, he added. I walked down my porch steps and stood at the edge of the slope. The grass was bare. The trees were gone. But the wind remembered. And so did I. Yes, I said finally. But only after they acknowledge what they did. Every word of it. Because this wasn't just about trees. It was about truth, about listening, about understanding that the land has its own rules. And if you ignore them, it doesn't matter what the HOA bylaws say. The wind doesn't care about paper. It only cares about space. And now it had found its way in. The official reports would later call it a localized wind event or a canyon-induced shear burst. But those of us who'd lived in Pine Hollow long enough knew better. It wasn't some freak anomaly or once-in-a-century gust. It was what happened when nature, long kept in check by thoughtful planning and quiet protection, was suddenly left bare. Saturday night was chaos. By dusk, the wind had intensified to a level I hadn't seen since my field days. Roof tiles sailed like cards across the cul-de-sacs. Trash bins clattered down driveways. The air took on that electric tension that makes dogs whimper and people snap at each other over nothing. I could see the pressure changes in my own windows bulging slightly, then easing like the house itself was breathing through clenched teeth. Across the street, emergency crews were still packing up. They'd boarded up the clubhouse windows and set up floodlights for visibility, though the light only made the swirling dust more surreal and eerie, artificial noon in the middle of nightfall. I spotted Karen sitting in her white SUV, phone pressed to her ear, her hand trembling against the steering wheel. Even from that distance, her silhouette looked cracked. By 10 p.m., the HOA sent out a mass email. Due to unforeseen wind damage, all future outdoor events are suspended pending safety inspections. There was no apology. No mention of the removed trees. Just unforeseen. But people knew. I started getting calls from neighbors, people who just days earlier had avoided eye contact with me at the mailbox. Now they were asking questions. Wes, did the trees really help that much? You think this would have been different if they were still up? Why didn't the board listen to you? I answered calmly, respectfully. But I didn't soften the truth. Yes, they mattered. Yes, this was preventable. No, they didn't listen, but now they will. Because by Sunday morning, the aftermath was undeniable. 3 homes reported cracked window panes. Several had damaged siding. One homeowner, Mr. Ferris, a quiet retired welder with a love for model trains, had his entire backyard gazebo lifted and thrown onto his neighbor's fence. The HOA clubhouse pride of the community had sustained more than $40,000 in structural damage. The east-facing wall needed full reconstruction. The patio furniture was destroyed. Several children's bikes left out during the festival had been flung into the community pool, now filled with leaves, dirt, and 2 rogue Halloween skeletons. And everyone knew what used to stand between all of that and the wind. Me. My trees. The HOA called for an emergency meeting that afternoon. I didn't plan on going. I truly didn't. I figured the evidence spoke louder than I ever could. But when Rick from the board came to my porch in person, hat in hand, I changed my mind. He looked like he hadn't slept. Wes, he said, Karen's doubling down. She says we acted within scope, that this was a natural disaster, not a board failure. But a lot of us don't believe that anymore. I nodded slowly. She says you're trying to smear us, he added. I gave him a long look. I haven't said a single word publicly. I know, he said. That's why people are listening now. So I went. The emergency HOA meeting was standing room only. It was supposed to be board only, but when half the neighborhood showed up uninvited, they had to open the doors. People came with questions. Damage reports printed out screenshots of wind forecasts. Some came with nothing more than crossed arms and narrowed eyes. Karen sat at the center of the front table, visibly rattled, but clinging to authority. We'll begin with agenda item 1, she said through the microphone. Damage control and insurance coordination. I raised my hand. She paused. Mr. Dalton, this is not a public comment period. Then make it one, someone shouted from the back. Karen blinked. More hands went up, then voices. Let him speak. Those trees saved my yard for years. Why'd you remove them without telling us? Karen glanced at Rick, who gave her a tight nod. She leaned forward. Fine, 2 minutes. I stepped up. I didn't bring the binder. I didn't bring papers or charts or pictures. I brought my voice. My name is Wesley Dalton, I began, and I've lived in Pine Hollow for 12 years. I planted that windbreak with my own hands after retiring from the U.S. Forest Service. Those trees weren't there to look pretty. They were there because this land, this ridgeline, this valley, it remembers. The wind. It channels it, funnels it. That's why the trees mattered. They weren't decoration. They were armor. A murmur moved through the crowd. I documented every planting. I filed surveys. I worked with the state. And when I was told they were unsightly, I responded calmly. I provided evidence. I submitted letters. I was ignored. Karen's mouth opened, but she didn't speak. I didn't speak out to shame anyone, I continued. I spoke out to protect this neighborhood. Because when you remove nature's defenses without understanding what they were holding back, you invite disaster. I paused, letting the silence settle. And now here we are. I stepped back. There was no applause, just a heavy stillness. The sound of people thinking, reckoning. Rick turned on his mic. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. I move that we suspend further discussion until we consult with city planners, environmental advisors, and legal counsel to understand the full scope of this situation. The motion passed 8-1. Karen's was the only dissenting vote. As I left, neighbors stopped me. Some shook my hand. Some apologized. One woman, Melissa from Lot 52, handed me a bundt cake and whispered, "I'm sorry I called your yard wilderness. You were right. But I wasn't after apologies. I was after acknowledgement, and nature had made my case for me in full. The wind was dying down now, slowly. The trees were gone. But the message they carried had finally landed. I thought naively that once the storm proved the point, the fight would be over. But if there's one thing more persistent than wind, it's pride. And Karen McClintock's pride didn't just dig in, it built a trench and brought sandbags. 2 days after the emergency meeting, I received a letter slid under my front door. No stamp, no envelope, just a single sheet printed on HOA letterhead and signed in bold black ink. Formal notification of potential liability, Lot 116. According to the letter, I had failed to maintain adequate landscaping control, neglected to participate in the HOA's visual perimeter review, and knowingly allowed an environmental hazard to develop over time, culminating in community-wide damages during the October wind event. It was surreal. They were blaming me, my land, my trees, my loss. Karen was twisting it all into an accusation that I'd allowed the disaster to happen by planting unauthorized vegetation, by failing to warn the board of the risk, and by refusing to comply with community standards. I stared at the letter for a long time, rage simmering just below the surface. Then I picked up the phone. "August," I said as soon as he answered, "we've got a new development." After I read him the letter, he let out a slow whistle. "She's panicking," he said. "That's the sound of a sinking ship throwing accusations overboard. Can she make it stick? Legally, no. But in the court of public opinion, it muddies the water. That's what she wants. If she can convince the community that you were some rogue landowner endangering everyone with your trees, it gives her cover." I exhaled. "Then it's time I speak publicly." We decided to hold a private mediation session first per HOA bylaws. It was a required step before formal litigation. August sent the request to their counsel. Meanwhile, I contacted a reporter I knew from my Forest Service days. Daniel Reeds, now working a column at the Pine County Tribune. I told him the basics. I offered to show him the documents, the before and after satellite images, the grant approval forms, the state recommendations, even the warnings from Nancy. He didn't hesitate. "This is bigger than a neighborhood spat," he said. "It's a case study in HOA overreach and environmental negligence." The article published 2 days later. Winds of Consequence: How HOA Mismanagement Cost a Neighborhood Its Natural Shield. It included aerial images of the property, a diagram of wind patterns before and after the tree removal, and an interview with Nancy Yates, outlining how rare and critical those kinds of windbreaks were. The piece went viral, at least locally. Neighbors printed it out. Some taped it to their mailboxes. Others posted it on the HOA's community board before Karen had it removed. But it was too late. The seed had been planted. At mediation, Karen arrived late, flanked by 2 attorneys in dark suits who looked as uncomfortable as she did angry. August and I were already seated, folders organized, projector ready. The mediator, a calm middle-aged man named Watt Warren, greeted us with a practiced neutrality. We presented our case first. I walked through the land deed, the topographic overlays, the slope risk data. August showed the grant documents, the conservation designations, and even video footage from my wind tests post-removal. We explained how the HOA acted without notice, without legal jurisdiction, and in direct violation of environmental protocols. Karen's team objected, of course. They claimed the area was ambiguous, the trees were deteriorating, and the board had acted in the best interest of community safety. That word again, safety. I couldn't help but laugh softly. When it was her turn to speak, Karen's voice was cool, but cracks showed through. "We believe Mr. Dalton failed to disclose the risk his trees posed to adjacent properties, particularly their density and growth pattern. His refusal to engage with the community on landscaping standards created confusion regarding responsibility. Warren raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting the windstorm damage was caused by his failure to prevent it? Karen hesitated. I'm suggesting he had information he didn't share, she replied, and that his plantings, unauthorized and unmanaged, contributed to confusion about where responsibility lay. It was a weak argument, and Warren knew it. He turned to me. Mr. Dalton, is it true you notified the board in writing of the tree's purpose and location? I nodded. Twice. Once by letter, once by certified email. No one responded. And you documented the boundaries with 3 separate surveys, including GPS overlays. Warren sat back. I think we can conclude the HOA acted without proper authority. One of Karen's attorneys leaned in to whisper. She stiffened. Warren continued. My recommendation, unless formal litigation is preferred, is that the HOA issue a written apology, agree to a replanting plan, and cover Mr. Dalton's legal and land remediation costs. Otherwise, I believe he will succeed in court, especially with the press coverage and agency support. The silence in that room was the kind that only comes from checkmate. Karen said nothing, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. The next day, I received a letter this time. In an envelope this time typed with official headers and full acknowledgement of procedural oversight and boundary misinterpretation. There was no mention of liability or guilt, just a polite, sterile paragraph about moving forward in cooperation. But I knew what it meant. So did everyone else. The wind had carried the truth farther than her accusations ever could. And Pine Hollow was beginning to listen. I never wanted to go to court. I'd seen enough of conflict in my life. Wildfires didn't negotiate, and neither did bureaucracy. But sometimes the only way to end something is to go all the way through it. Karen refused to settle. Despite the mediator's clear assessment, despite the storm's proof, despite the article that half the county had now read and reposted, she insisted on setting the record straight in legal proceedings. I got the email from her counsel 2 days after mediation. We respectfully decline the proposed settlement. Our client believes the facts have been misrepresented and welcomes a judicial review. August forwarded it to me with a simple note. So be it. We filed the suit the following Monday. Dalton v. Pine Hollow HOA. Citing unlawful destruction of property, environmental negligence, and violation of state conservation statutes. Within a week, 3 more parties joined the filing, 2 adjacent homeowners whose fences were damaged in the storm, and Maria, my neighbor, who had documented the tree removal in real time with her phone from her second-story window. The HOA board tried to circle the wagons. They sent out another community email, this one thick with legalese and spin. We stand by our actions as being in the best interest of our members. And certain individuals have chosen to litigate rather than collaborate. But something had shifted. People weren't buying it anymore. At the next community open forum, the mood was different. The smug smiles were gone. The forced community pride mantras fell flat. Karen still chaired the meeting, but her voice lacked its usual command. She was surrounded by a board that now looked more like a lineup of people silently trying not to get caught in the crossfire. That night, Rick caught me on my evening walk. You've got more support than you think, he said quietly. There's going to be a vote soon. Board re-election. Just be ready. I nodded. What about Karen? He sighed. She doesn't realize how close she is to losing it all. The court date was set for early December. By then, Pine Hollow looked different. The days had grown short. The storm had stripped leaves from trees all over the neighborhood, and the bare branches now mirrored the stripped patience of its residents. I spent the days leading up to trial organizing every scrap of evidence. I wasn't just fighting for trees. I was fighting for what they represented. Care foresight and the right to defend your land from blind arrogance. The courtroom was small, just a local civil bench in a sandstone building with peeling linoleum floors. Karen arrived flanked by her legal team. I came in alone at first, but when I turned to sit, I saw the gallery. Maria, Rick, Tyler Finch, who now looked ashamed every time he passed me. 3 families whose kids had screamed during the glass break. And Daniel Reed's notepad in hand scribbling in silence. August started with a calm, firm delivery of the case. He didn't dramatize. He didn't attack. He laid out a chain of decisions backed by dates maps, letters, and a timeline so precise it felt surgical. Then I took the stand. I spoke about the planting, the reasons behind it, the federal grants, the Ridge Fire of 1998. I described how wind funnels work, how tree canopies change air pressure, how one row of properly spaced pines can reduce wind force on a structure by up to 30%. I showed the forecasts, the anemometer readings. I handed over a printed copy of Nancy Yates's official letter. Karen's team objected often, but the judge allowed most of it through. Then came Karen's turn. She took the stand with a calm, practiced posture. Her voice was precise even. The board did what it believed was necessary, she said. We consulted our usual landscaping contractor, who assured us the trees were not essential. We were unaware of any grant or protective status. Mr. Dalton did not make that information available to us in a formal capacity. And once the trees were removed, the storm damage was unfortunately beyond our control. Unaware, August stood. Do you acknowledge receipt of Mr. Dalton's certified letters? Karen blinked. I don't recall. August handed a printed delivery receipt to the clerk. Dated September 3rd, signed by your assistant with your name listed in the recipient field. Karen said nothing. Then August pulled out a final piece, a photograph of the windbreak from the year before printed beside a post-storm image of the shattered clubhouse windows. No further questions, he said. The judge took 1 week to review. During that time, things in Pine Hollow broke open. The Pine County Tribune ran a second piece. HOA on trial. A community learns the price of ignoring nature. Letters to the editor poured in. Neighbors emailed the board demanding answers. Some called for Karen's resignation outright. When the ruling came, it wasn't just a win. It was a statement. The court finds that the HOA acted outside its authority in removing vegetation on private property without consent, causing demonstrable harm. Damages awarded to the plaintiff in full. The HOA is further ordered to fund an ecological restoration plan overseen by a certified forestry advisor and to issue formal community notice of the ruling. Karen didn't attend the final hearing. She resigned quietly 2 days later. And when I walked outside the next morning, I found a note on my porch, folded in half, placed under a small rock. It was written in delicate, shaking cursive. I voted for her. I'm sorry I didn't ask you what the trees were for. Thank you for not backing down. Jamlat 28. I folded the paper, tucked it in my pocket, and looked out over the slope. The ground was still bare, but that would change. The wind had shifted, and now it was time to rebuild. The first tree I replanted was a bur oak. Strong, slow-growing, stubborn in its roots, like I had to become. I chose a late autumn morning when the air had finally quieted and the ground had begun to soften after weeks of dryness. The soil wasn't ready, not fully, but neither was I. And maybe that was fitting. I dug the hole myself. No contractors, no volunteers, just me, a pair of old gloves, and the silence that followed a season of wind and upheaval. The community watched, but from a distance. Some peeked through windows. Others passed slowly on their morning walks, offering nods or quiet greetings. The boldest among them, Rick Maria, a woman named Umi Elise. From Lot 44, stepped closer, offering coffee, extra saplings, even to help dig. I let them. Not because I needed the help, but because healing like wind needs space to move. The HOA, under new leadership, had agreed, per the court's order, to fund the full replanting of the windbreak. But I'd insisted on supervising every step. No subcontractors without forestry experience. No decorative landscaping crews treating it like a beautification project. These weren't decorations. They were guardians. We chose the species carefully. Reintroduced Austrian pines and bur oaks, but also layered in Rocky Mountain junipers and silver buffalo berry to diversify the ecosystem. Nancy Yates helped design the layout. She even came out in person one weekend, standing on the edge of the slope in her work boots and state-issued windbreaker, smiling like we'd come full circle. This, she said, resting a hand on the young sapling I just anchored. This is what resilience looks like. The restoration plan would take 3 years. Full canopy growth would take 15. I probably wouldn't live in Pine Hollow forever, but I'd stay long enough to see the line begin to rise again, to see the wind slow when it reached the trunks, to hear the first rustle of needles returning to the slope. The new HOA board, now chaired by Rick, held their first open forum that winter. It was a different room than the ones Karen used to rule. Warmer, less defensive. They invited me to speak. I said no at first. But then I realized this wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about memory, about making sure the new roots grew deeper than the old wounds. So I stood before my neighbors and told them the story not with anger, but with clarity. I planted those trees because I knew what this land needed, not because I wanted to defy anyone, not because I thought I was smarter than the board, but because I had seen what happens when you ignore the land's warning signs. And I didn't want that to happen here. There was no applause, just silence. The kind that means people are actually listening. Later after the meeting, a man I barely knew, a quiet widower named Old Greg from Lot 9, came up to me and shook my hand. "I lost my fence in that storm," he said. "Was mad at first. Wanted to blame someone. But then I read the paper, saw what you went through, and I realized we let it happen. We let someone cut corners because it looked clean on paper. You saw what was underneath. Thank you for not letting it slide." That meant more than the court ruling, even more than the restoration itself. Because change isn't just about planting new trees. It's about planting understanding. The wind didn't vanish. That wasn't the goal. It still came down from the canyon some mornings cold and impatient, but now it met resistance. Even the young trees made a difference, slowing, breaking, reshaping its course. One afternoon in early spring, I sat at the edge of the slope with my granddaughter, Lily. Ethan had brought her to visit for the weekend. She was 6, curious, fearless, and obsessed with worms. She pointed to a line of new saplings and asked, "Why did they cut down the old ones, Grandpa?" I paused. "Because they didn't understand what they were for," I said. She frowned. "But you did." I tried. She reached out and gently touched the leaf of the closest tree. "I think they're pretty." "They're strong," I corrected, smiling. Later that evening, I found a small package at my door. Inside was a framed print. Someone had taken one of Daniel's Tribune photos of the broken clubhouse windows during the storm and laid it side by side with a current image of the new saplings growing in their place. Below it, a single caption read, "Wounds are where the light and the roots enter." No note, just the image, but I didn't need one. I hung it in my front hallway. As the seasons shifted, Pine Hollow did too. The Halloween banners were replaced with hand-painted signs asking about composting. The HOA added a section to the monthly newsletter called Living with the Land, where local kids submitted nature drawings and weather reports. Someone started a tree ring club. The empty spaces that once held silence now held stories. I stayed on the edge of it all, not distant, but grounded. The wind still moved, but so did we. And for once, we were finally moving with it.